The most important step from shapes to patterns usually is some form of repetition. You have already seen that the absolute operation can be used to mirror a shape by mirroring the used coordinates. In the same sense, there are multiple different operations to make coordinates repeat, analogous to the array modifier. While the absolute operation flips the negative values to be positive and creates mirrored coordinates this way, operations like fraction, for example, make coordinates repeat. Fraction just cuts off the integer part of a value and returns only the decimals. That means that after going from 0 to 1, instead of going from 1 to 2, the coordinate wraps around and just goes from 0 to 1 again. You can easily incorporate repetitions into shapes to make use of, for example, rotational symmetry. Earlier, we mapped the angular gradient around the center so it goes from 0 to 1 in one rotation. If we now stretch this 6 times and apply the fraction operation, the gradient goes from 0 to 1 repeatedly, 6 times. And you can also combine mirror operations and a repetition. Like we have seen before, you can use the absolute operation for the mirroring, but in this case, it is much simpler to just use the ping-pong operation. That operation does not repeat only from 0 to 1, but back to 0 again, and this way achieves both repetition and mirroring. This way, it is easy, for example, to create a flower shape like this, but because from 0 to 1 is only half a petal of the flower, we are left with only 3 and not 6, so that number has to be multiplied by 2. To repeat this whole shape infinitely over the surface, we can use the same trick with the fraction operation. But this time, we have to manipulate the very first incoming coordinates that are used for the whole shape. After what you have already seen, it should make sense that if you are repeating coordinates, the same shape is generated in the places with the same coordinates. I want the shape to be repeated along both axes, and just so I don't have to manipulate the x and the y coordinate individually, instead of using the regular math node, this time I am using the vector math node. The vector math node, apart from some operations that are specific to vectors, in general has some of the same functions that the regular math node has. For those, it just works in a way that it applies the operation to all x, y, z channels individually. In multiply mode, for example, it just multiplies the first, second, and third channels of both inputs in pairs. For the repetition, I use the fraction operation again and combine it with a scale operation that multiplies the whole vector with a value. But now we have that problem again, that the shape we created is located in a space between -1 and +1, while the fraction operation returns a range of 0 to 1. So we have to remap again. Here, I want to do this using more vector math nodes, subtracting 0.5 and multiplying by 2. Now that the repetition is properly set up, I can just crank up the scale factor here, and the pattern expands infinitely. Of course, because all of these shapes are using these same nodes, I can just change them around and all update at the same time. To get some variation into this pattern, we can use another very useful concept. The repeating coordinate vectors separate the surface into individual cells. But right now, every cell is the exact same. If we, instead of the fraction operation, use a snap operation with an increment of 1, we get a different value for each of these resulting cells. This value is constant for each individual cell, and as you can see, represents the position of the cell. When we now use the snapped coordinates as the input to a noise texture, we get random values for each of the cells. This is where the white noise comes in incredibly handy. With a random noise, each of these values should be different, so that process can be described as assigning each cell with an ID. Now, these random values can be used for all sorts of things. By driving the parameters that decide how the shape is created with those values, you can easily achieve a variety of random features. For example, you can just change the scale of the individual shapes by adding a multiply node and plugging it in here. But you still need to control the random values. You can just change the range of what scale it should be with another map range node.